So hello, Amanda and Roshni. I guess I'm just going to do kind of a video thing. Didn't really prepare slides this time, so I'll just be doing it kind of podcast style. But so no real need to watch the video. I guess it's just going to be me talking, but just to let you know. Anyways, so to be honest, there's a lot to reflect and to say about my experiences in Steveson. But when reflecting on it, what's really struck me the most was seeing firsthand and conceptualizing, I guess, this like incredible capacity fisheries have in their impact on the landscape and the lives that they can influence. And really how tough, harmful, and abusive a fishery can be. I really felt it there. I know this is really something we discussed in great detail in class. And seeing, and probably like an underlying theme that I felt throughout, and something we really brought up in our discussions, and just how the structure and management of these fisheries directly influences that. But I guess I really hadn't felt it in the classroom like I had at Steveson. This negative impact mismanaged fisheries can have. Like when I walked through Britannia Shipyard, Fisherman's Wharf, and the Gulf of Georgia Cannery, I really felt it. So I felt for all the people involved in this harmful, abusive, and destructive fishery like this one, and Steveson, I really felt that it was their life too, which is something I had a hard time, I guess, conceptualizing until then. So seeing how this salmon fishery of British Columbia in the late 1800s functioned, imagining the lives of those who worked within, feeling its impact on the landscape and the environment, it's hard not to feel and to think like, couldn't it have been done differently? So why did it not? Why did the people involved continue to engage with it and then seemingly cause so much hardship and destruction? I guess that's kind of what I want to speak to today, and my thoughts that have been inspired as a result of the field trip. So to begin, in the words of one of the local fishermen we had the opportunity to speak with at the Fisherman's Wharf, who I cannot remember their name, and I looked through all our resources but could not find it. He was the one wearing the double red flannel in true fisherman fashion. But he said that not all fishers are bad. There's just good fishing methods and bad. So I guess I'll begin with the people and my impressions of it. So many of the buildings that date back to 1885, told stories of told the stories of the multi-ethnic residents and workers at the Britannia Cannery and shipyards. The Chinese, First Nations, and Japanese immigrants and workers there. What really struck me was the hardships that these workers felt, the terrible living conditions like we saw at the Chinese bunkhouse at Steveson, and the horrific working conditions in the monster cannery at the Gulf of Georgia. The stench and the smell, and just they must have been terrible. And that was something that I just kept feeling throughout. And it was just it was just this last remaining cannery of 15 others that were present in the area. The scale was extraordinary, and all of these people supporting this fishery. So it really has inspired a lot of thought how at first glance, and my first thought was, it left me with a feeling of grief and how all this suffering felt unnecessary and really quite illogical. To the people there, and like to me, it seems like I mentioned that all the suffering can seem unnecessary and illogical, but obviously the people were there for a reason, and all the people there, the Chinese, the Japanese, First Nation workers, the 100 to 150 people that it took to run these canneries and fisheries, for just one cannery, through the numerous pressures such as like targeted discrimination and laws, like forcing Japanese workers to only be able to work in either the railway or the fisheries, racism and social situation, like racism and social situations, like back in the day, like just for example, like seeing the machine called the automated chink, stuff like that was, and terrible. Like it showed a real societal pressure to be in that industry, and the numerous other constraints like the indigenous people that were stripped of the rights of their land and needing to feed themselves and work here, the Chinese immigrants that were needed to pay off their debts and that for safe passage that were misled to believe that it was the land of gold, And the Japanese immigrants, like I mentioned, with no other option besides work in a deadly railroad, they all needed to be there. And for me, that, I was thinking how unnecessary and illogical all the suffering was for them. It felt like they had to. So I guess what was interesting for me was like how, I guess, these people still felt that they needed to be there, and were kind of forced by the society, but also I imagine themselves as well to tolerate these hardships. And tragically, I viewed that. Tragically, I imagine they viewed that these hardships were necessary to support their livelihoods. So I really felt that was really powerful for me. Was I guess imagining that, what at first glance seems like something that is completely full of unnecessary hardship, for them seemed necessary. And then I'll continue on, I guess, with discussion of the place. So, it was an incredible bundle of like place and like landscape that can also be subject to a lot of abuse by the fishery. So this is an incredibly beautiful, abundant place, the mouth of the Fraser River, where we were. I remember seeing on one of the signs that in the cannery that said that salmon were caught in excess and just tossed back into the river at the end of the day. And that according to one informatic poster, it said that one worker mentioned that you were able to walk across the backs of salmon on the Fraser River, and how they didn't really have any concept of an end to this abundance. And that led to an incredibly unsustainable catch. Canneries were unable to process them, with hundreds of thousands of salmon being discarded. With one catch, I remember reading on a poster in 1887, known as the embarrassment of fish, where they just threw away so much because the cannery couldn't process it. So it's this incredibly abusive mentality too of the landscape. Similarly, when talking to local fishermen at Fisherman's Wharf, hearing them discuss the differences in the Alaskan and Canadian fisheries management, this abuse and mentality is still present in other fisheries, not just the salmon fishery in the 1880s, in the late 1800s. Like, so he mentioned that Alaska didn't cut a lot of sheds like they did, like we did in BC. They didn't fish as hard as we did. And they opened fish hatcheries and didn't industrialize like we did, in part. And like Amanda mentioned this, and I did some more research that it was due to the Magnuson-Steveson Act in 1976, which addressed these twin problems of overfishing and overcapacity, and required management measures to prevent this. But it's also, he mentioned the local fisher did mention that Alaska didn't allow for leasing quotas and consolidation of small boats into large industrial boats, which all led to an abuse. In his words, it was just shit ass management. So now their catch is around 2.5 million tons of salmon, as I believe he mentioned. And he said that theirs in Canada was around 1 million. So it was just kind of, I guess by me discussing that, it was to bring to light how it could be done differently, and that, I don't know, just I guess the hardship, that the impact that of negative methods in Canada as well is still present. So in combination between the hardships of land and the hardships of people, in both situations and both cases I mentioned that both seem like they could have been done differently, and both seem unnecessary, unreasonable, and that firstly anybody would be able to cope and tolerate with the hardships that they did, sleeping in the tiny bunkhouses and working in terrible conditions, and tons of racism for little to no pay, and famine and hardship and drug abuse. And then on the other hand, how people could abuse the land and resources around them with seemingly little disregard, and even is really fascinating. And I'm seeing that in both of those situations, people viewed it as necessary for them to live. So this field trip really inspired me to think about from the perspective of the individuals working in the fisheries, and how and specifically individuals working in these harmful fisheries, and to think about it from their perspective, and how even though they are part of it and in turn supporting it, something that I may perceive as completely illogical and not normal, they perceive as necessary and normal. So how can we begin to, help these people conceptualize and reimagine that there's another way to construct and manage these fisheries? That is something I'm feeling very inspired by after this field trip. And in the words of Paulie Carilla, a West Coast fisherman and senior policy advisor to the Coastal First Nations, which I saw written on a plaque in the Gulf of Georgia Cannery. It's people that have impacted salmon negatively, but it's people that will bring them back and keep them going. So when I ask myself, I realize that there's no solution that is straightforward to this, like getting people to reimagine and reconceptualize, and then, beginning to work with to reconceptualize and remanage these harmful fisheries. But when we begin to do so, I begin to see the complexity of the issue, and like our need to address the underlying social, legislative, and conceptual understandings that we have of each other and of the landscape and the world that we have around us. It was really, really honestly inspiring just to feel the hardships that these people felt, the impact on the land, and how they felt it was necessary, when I nowadays, can reimagine something completely different, and in hindsight wish they had done something completely different. So how can we erase the gap between the two? So these are my thoughts and reflection, and thank you for listening. I hope it was somewhat interesting. So thanks.